The letter was short, almost tender. "Bring all your money," it said. "We will marry and live in happiness forever." The ink was still fresh when he folded it into his jacket pocket and boarded the train. He had no idea it was his death warrant. You've been told all your life that evil wears a face you can spot. That danger comes with snarling teeth, wild eyes, and darkness in plain sight. That's the first lie. The truth is far more lethal. The most dangerous predator you'll ever meet will make you feel safe. She'll offer you warmth, love, and a future you can taste, all while sharpening the knife behind her back. In the quiet farmland of La Porte, Indiana, the earth hides more than roots. Beneath the soil are bones, dozens of them, buried so deep the truth nearly stayed there forever. And at the center of it all was a woman named Belle Gunness, a widow whose smile could disarm the most suspicious man, and whose hunger for wealth and control made her one of history's most prolific killers. But this isn't just about her body count. This is about the machinery of seduction, the blueprint of control, and the psychology of a predator who understood exactly how to bend a man's desires into a noose. The newspapers called her the Mistress of Murder Hill. The locals called her cursed. But if you look deeper, if you strip away the easy headlines, you see something far more dangerous, as old as humanity, used by empires, cults, and power brokers. A system that turns trust into a weapon. What you're about to hear is not just the story of a woman who killed for money. It's the anatomy of manipulation, the kind of manipulation that still runs under the surface of our lives today. Belle Gunness's killing farm wasn't just a place. It was a theater. And every victim stepped onto the stage believing they were about to live the rest of their lives in paradise. The soil has been turned over, the graves are open, and once you see what she built, you will never again think of love, trust, or safety in the same way. The train screeched to a halt at La Porte station, steam curling into the winter air. He stepped off, clutching his suitcase, scanning the platform for the woman whose words had promised him salvation. Then he saw her, broad-shouldered, towering, with an apron dusted in flour, her smile warm enough to melt the frost. He didn't know that in a few days, his name would vanish from the world. Belle Gunness didn't hunt in the wild, she hunted in plain sight. Her weapon wasn't a gun or a blade at first, it was the pen. She placed carefully crafted advertisements in Lonely Hearts columns across the Midwest. Men looking for a wife, for a new start, for someone to anchor them in a drifting world, they found Belle. She told them she was a wealthy widow, with a large farm, aching for companionship. But there was a catch. She needed a man who could share in the responsibilities. And for that, he should bring all his savings. The hook was perfect. Each letter was bait, wrapped in charm. Each man believed he had been chosen, plucked from obscurity to share in a comfortable life. That's the genius of the predator. She made them feel like the hunter, like they had won her. The moment they believed that, they were already lost. When they arrived, she welcomed them with a feast, laughter, and the illusion of domestic peace. But within days, they disappeared. Their absence explained to neighbors with excuses so ordinary no one questioned them. He left for the West, she'd say. We argued, and he walked out. In an age without phones, without instant communication, those men simply evaporated. Belle's farm became a sinkhole for human life, each grave dug with care, each victim's remains hidden under the same earth they thought would grow their new life. And here's where the real terror lies, the same principles Belle used to lure her prey have been used by leaders, corporations, and governments for centuries. Make them feel chosen, offer them safety. Demand their resources in the name of shared prosperity. Then, take everything. Most men never see the trap until their feet are already tangled in it. They say killing once is an accident. Killing twice is a choice. Killing 40 times, that's a system. Belle Gunness didn't kill in chaos. She killed with the cold efficiency of someone running a profitable enterprise. Each man was an asset. Each visit, a transaction. The farm was her office, the barn her processing plant, the earth her ledger. Every grave was a line item, every body a deposit in her private bank of secrets. She had perfected a conveyor belt of death. Letters out, suitors in, assets liquidated, bodies buried. And the brilliance, if you can call it that, lay in her ability to blend this machinery with the softness of domestic life. Chickens in the yard, bread baking in the oven, the sound of cattle in the distance, all while a corpse cooled in the basement. Understand this, Belle wasn't simply murdering for money. She was building an empire of control. When you control someone's dreams, you control their decisions. When you control their decisions, you control their fate. She understood that men arriving at her door had already surrendered their judgment in exchange for the hope she offered. That surrender, once given, is almost impossible to reverse. This is the same psychological architecture you'll find in cults, black budget operations, and shadow economies. 1. Create a vision so compelling they see no alternative. 2. Invite them into the circle with flattery and exclusivity. 3. Require a sacrifice to prove loyalty, money, status, or dignity. 4. Close the exits so retreat feels impossible. 5. Extract the maximum value before discarding the subject entirely. For Belle, the discard meant death. For others who use this model, the predators hiding in our institutions, it means something more subtle: a lifetime of obedience, drained resources, and lost potential. What makes Belle's story dangerous to hear is not the number of graves she dug. It's that she revealed, perhaps without meaning to, a raw truth about human nature. When a man wants something badly enough, he will silence every warning bell in his mind. And the more he believes he has chosen freely, the deeper the chains he's already wearing. Out in the barn, she sharpened her tools. Another letter was in the mail. Another man was already on his way. It started with a sound, faint, metallic, like a chain dragged slowly across a wooden floor. The man lay in the guest room, staring into the dark. Hours earlier, Belle had served him a heavy stew and poured his glass again and again, insisting he enjoy himself after the long journey. Now, his stomach churned, not from the food, but from the strange sensation crawling up his spine. Something about the farm was too quiet. He'd asked earlier where the hired hands were, and Belle had smiled, almost indulgently, as if he'd made a childish remark. "Don't worry about that," she'd said. Her tone was soft but final. No more questions. When morning came, Belle greeted him with her usual warmth, her apron dusted with flour, a plate of eggs and bread waiting at the table. She spoke about their future. How they would expand the farm, how his savings would help buy more land. It was a conversation painted with the language of inevitability. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if he had already given everything. But then, mid-sentence, she froze. Her eyes shifted, not to him, but past him, to the barn outside. He turned to look, and for a split second, he swore he saw a shape, a figure. Too small to be a man, too slow to be an animal. By the time he turned back, Belle's expression had softened again. This is how the predator operates when the mask begins to slip, not with panic, but with calculated recovery. A new smile. A distracting question. A reminder of the dream she sold you. The human mind clings desperately to the story it wants to believe, even when the cracks appear. Especially when the cracks appear. Over breakfast, Belle mentioned the cellar. She said it was where she kept special preserves for honored guests. Her eyes held his just a moment too long. That was when the unease became something sharper, a primal signal buried deep in his nervous system. But by then, the machinery was already in motion. His arrival had been noticed by no one. His family believed he was moving here permanently. The roads were long, the town indifferent, and Belle knew something he didn't in this place. There were no witnesses. Somewhere in the barn, a shovel waited. The first to notice was not a sheriff, not a detective, but a neighbor. A wary old man named Chris, who had farmed the land beside Belle's for 20 years. Chris had seen the men come and go. At first, he thought nothing of it. After all, Belle was a widow, and widows remarried. But over time, the pattern began to itch at the back of his mind. They arrived with luggage, fine clothes, sometimes even livestock in tow. Then nothing. No wedding, no visits to town as a couple, no trace at all. The farm next to his was different now. Quieter in a way that didn't feel natural. Belle stopped chatting over the fence. The smell from her hog pen was stronger than it should have been, and sometimes, especially after dusk, Chris thought he heard the thud of digging, over and over, even in winter when the ground should have been too hard to break. One evening, curiosity pulled him to the property line. The moon was high, pale against a sky that looked carved from ice. He could see the outline of Belle in the barn, her shadow moving with deliberate rhythm. It wasn't the kind of work you did with livestock. It was the kind of work you did when you were hiding something. Chris knew the danger. In rural towns, accusations had consequences. If you were wrong, you destroyed someone's reputation. If you were right, you risked ending up in the same shallow hole as the ones you'd exposed. Still, the thought of doing nothing gnawed at him. The next day, he tried to probe gently. Passing Belle in the road, he made a casual remark about the new suitor he'd seen arriving. She didn't smile this time. She didn't even slow her pace. Her eyes flicked to his, sharp as a blade, and for a moment, he felt as if she had already measured the dimensions of his grave. What Chris didn't know was that Belle had a rule: suspicion was as dangerous as betrayal. Those who asked too many questions didn't just receive fewer answers, they disappeared. In towns like La Porte, power wasn't about titles or wealth, it was about fear, who you could make vanish without a trace, and who you could convince to stay silent forever. Belle had mastered both, and now, Chris was on her list. It was the dogs that found it first. Chris had been out early, tending his fences, when he heard the barking, frantic, unrelenting. He followed the sound toward a shallow creek that cut between his land and Belle's. There, half buried in the thawing mud, was something pale and curved. At first, he thought it was the remains of a hog. But as he knelt, brushing away the silt with trembling fingers, he saw the shape clearly. A human jawbone, still holding two teeth. For a moment, the world went silent. Only the cold wind moved through the trees. Chris stood slowly, his heart pounding, scanning the fields for any sign of her. The barn door was open, just enough to see darkness inside. Most men in his position would have run straight to the sheriff. But Chris knew better. Out here, you didn't accuse without proof. Not against someone like Belle. She had influence in the town, a strange kind of pull that made people defend her without question. If he went in with only a jawbone and a suspicion, she'd turn the whole community against him. Worse, she might decide to remove him entirely. That's the art of true power, to control not just what people see, but what they allow themselves to believe. Belle knew how to plant seeds of doubt, how to smear anyone who threatened her story. In an era without photographs or forensics, the truth was whatever the survivors said it was. And Belle always survived. Later that afternoon, Chris saw her in town. She was laughing with the butcher, handing him a basket of eggs. If she knew about the jawbone, it didn't show. In fact, she looked almost radiant, as if she had just secured another victory. And maybe she had. Because the real weapon Belle carried wasn't in her kitchen or her barn. It was in her ability to make the impossible seem normal. She could bury 40 men in her fields, and people would still tell themselves they had simply moved on, lost contact, started new lives elsewhere. Chris slipped the jawbone into a sack and hid it in his barn. He didn't know it yet, but he was now holding the first piece of a puzzle that, once assembled, would bring hell crashing down on Murder Hill. And Belle Gunness was already preparing for it. The most dangerous predators don't hide in shadows. They stand in the center of the crowd and make the crowd believe they're the hero. When whispers began to ripple through La Porta, questions about the men who came to Belle's farm and never returned, she didn't retreat. She advanced. Belle walked into the heart of town with her head high, her voice sweet, her stories polished. She told anyone who would listen that her suitors had been disappointing, that they had promised her one thing and delivered another. That, in truth, she was the victim. A lonely widow, misled by greedy men who only wanted her money. The genius was in the detail. She didn't outright deny their existence. Instead, she reframed the narrative. "Oh, yes, he stayed here for a while," she would say. "But when I refused to give him control of my farm, he stormed off." By acknowledging the man's presence, she made herself seem honest. By controlling the ending, she made herself seem blameless. Soon, the townsfolk began to repeat her words as if they were their own observations. "Poor Belle," they'd say. "Such bad luck with men." Even the sheriff, a man whose job was to suspect everyone, found himself defending her. If something had happened to those fellows, he told Chris with a chuckle, we'd have found evidence by now. That's the real art of psychological control. You don't just silence your critics, you make them carry your water. You embed your version of reality so deeply into their minds that they will defend it as if it were their own. Leaders do it, prophets do it, dictators do it. Belle Gunness did it with a pie in the oven and a sad story about her lonely heart. Meanwhile, the farm kept taking in new guests. New suitors arrived by train, stepping into the same trap with smiles on their faces. Chris watched from his property line, jaw tight, knowing that each handshake Belle offered was another death sentence signed in invisible ink. And through it all, Belle kept her eyes on Chris. Not openly, not threateningly, but in the way you watch a clock when you know it's winding down. She could sense the shift in him. She knew he had seen too much. And in her mind, the solution was simple. The best way to silence suspicion is to bury it. The invitation came wrapped in politeness, but it was lined with teeth. Belle approached Chris one late afternoon, the sky dimming to gold. She waved from her side of the fence, her voice warm, almost sisterly. "Chris," she called, "I've baked too much bread again. You'll help me eat it, won't you?" On the surface, it was neighborly generosity. But Chris knew better. He had spent weeks feeling her eyes on him, noting how she had started to appear in places she never lingered before. The edge of his field, the road to town, even near his barn when she claimed to be just passing by. She was watching him with the same interest she once reserved for new suitors. He forced a polite smile, nodding, maybe another day. Her face didn't change, but her eyes narrowed just enough to register the decline. Declining Belle Gunness was dangerous. Most men didn't live long enough to do it twice. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. A pie left on his porch. A chance meeting at the general store where she asked about his family back in Norway. An offer to help him fix his fence, which would have put her alone on his property, far from any witnesses. Chris felt it like a noose tightening. She wasn't just testing his friendliness. She was probing for weakness, for the right angle to pull him into her sphere and close the trap. The truth was, Belle didn't need him to want her. She just needed him to step far enough into her world that no one would question it when he vanished. That's how predators adapt. If seduction won't work, opportunity will. Chris began carrying his rifle everywhere, not because he planned to use it, but because he wanted her to see it. He needed her to believe he was prepared, that he wasn't just another desperate fool with love in his eyes. But even as he tried to ward her off, he knew the fight was uneven. Belle was playing on her own land, under her own rules, with a town that would side with her over him in a heartbeat. And in the quiet hours of the night, Chris couldn't shake the question that kept clawing at his mind. How many men had thought they could outsmart her, and were now just bones in the ground? The answer was 40. And she was still counting. Sometimes the truth doesn't surface because someone goes looking for it. Sometimes it stumbles out of the dark, dragging its own chain behind it. Chris was in town when he saw him. A tall, broad man in a worn brown coat, stepping off the train with a heavy trunk. Belle was there too, waiting at the platform, her face lit with that same disarming smile Chris had seen a dozen times before. She took the man's arm like they were already lovers, guiding him toward the waiting cart. But Chris noticed something the others didn't: the trunk. It wasn't just heavy, it was locked, reinforced, the kind a man uses for valuables. And when the cart hit a rut, the lid shifted just enough for Chris to catch a glimpse inside. Paper. Dozens of envelopes bound together with twine. 2 nights later, the man was gone. No goodbye. No trip to town. Belle told anyone who asked that he'd changed his mind and taken a job in Chicago. But Chris knew better. He waited until Belle went into town, then crossed the property line and slipped into the barn. It was there, in the far corner under a burlap sack, that he found it. One of the envelopes from the trunk. The seal was broken. Inside was a letter written to the man's sister, explaining how he was moving to La Porte to marry Belle Gunness, bringing his life savings with him. He had been proud, almost boastful. And now he was gone. Chris didn't pocket the letter immediately. He stood there in the dim barn light, feeling the weight of it in his hands. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. The kind of proof that could turn whispers into law, that could make even the sheriff act. But proof is a dangerous thing, because the moment you hold it, you become a target. He tucked the envelope into his coat and left, careful not to disturb anything else. But Belle had a sixth sense for shifts in the air. When she returned that evening, she paused in the barn, her eyes sweeping the corners. Something was missing. That night, Chris heard footsteps on his porch. Slow. Deliberate. They didn't knock. They didn't call out. And when they left, the sound of gravel underfoot was followed by the unmistakable crunch of a shovel biting into earth. The race had begun. Predators kill with teeth and claws. Masters kill with time. Belle didn't need to rush. She knew the ground she stood on, both the soil and the invisible terrain of power. Chris had something she wanted, but he had to bring it into the open for it to matter. And that meant she could maneuver, slowly tightening the perimeter, making every path he might take toward the sheriff dangerous. The first move came the next morning. 2 men from town, friends of Belle's, showed up at Chris's door, claiming they'd heard he was spreading hoogly stories about her. Their tone was casual, but their eyes weren't. They stayed too long, looking over his tools, his land, his home, as if taking stock of it. Chris knew the message: you're being watched. Belle's second move was more subtle. When Chris went into town to buy supplies, he found his usual credit with the grocer mysteriously revoked. Nothing personal? The man said quietly, but I've got to be careful. Belle's good for business. It was the same with the blacksmith, the grain dealer, even the man who sold him kerosene. She was cutting him off, making him an island. That's the essence of high-level control. You don't just attack the body. You strangle the support systems. Isolate the target. Make them so desperate they either crawl back into the fold or crumble before they can fight back. Chris understood now that the letter in his coat wasn't just evidence. It was a death sentence with his name on it. The only way to survive was to make it too costly for Belle to touch him. But how do you make a predator fear you? He started small, dropping hints in the saloon, letting certain men overhear him say he had documents. Belle wouldn't want the sheriff to see. He never said what they were, only that they existed. The key was to make her believe that if she struck, the evidence would surface on its own. And it worked, to a point. Belle didn't approach him directly. Instead, she watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. But Chris knew the silence wasn't safety, it was calculation. She was looking for the crack in his armor, the moment she could strike without risk. At night, he slept with the rifle propped against the wall. And every time he closed his eyes, he heard the same sound in his head, the crunch of a shovel in gravel. Because in La Porte, Indiana, when Belle Gunness wanted you gone, you were already halfway buried. When cornered, some predators flee. Others burn the entire forest around them. Belle must have realized Chris was too stubborn to scare, too cautious to lure in, and too clever to confront outright. That left her with only one weapon: chaos. If she couldn't eliminate him quietly, she could ignite something so violent, so consuming, that the truth would be buried under the ashes. It started with rumors. Whispers that Chris had been seen with one of Belle's missing suitors, shortly before the man vanished. A couple of drunks in the saloon swore they overheard Chris plotting a robbery. Someone claimed he'd been pawning gold watches that looked suspiciously like those the suitors wore. By the end of the week, he wasn't just the outsider anymore. He was the outsider who might be dangerous. Then came the livestock. Chris woke one morning to find 3 of his cows dead, their bodies bloated and stiff. The vet said it was poisoning. Belle sent a pie the next day as if to console him, and just when he thought it couldn't get worse, so it did. One cold, gray morning, the smell of smoke threaded through the air. Chris followed it, heart pounding, until he saw it: Belle's farmhouse. Flames were chewing through the roof, devouring the wood in great, roaring gulps. But this wasn't an accident. Even from a distance, Chris could see the pattern: oil poured in trails, leading from the barn to the house. People from town rushed to help, but the fire was already too far gone. And when the roof finally caved, the crowd froze. There were bodies inside. At first glance, they thought Belle had been among the dead, but as the ashes cooled, doubts crept in. The remains were too small, the skull fractured in a way that didn't match the collapse. And Belle herself was nowhere to be found. Chris knew exactly what had happened. This was her scorched earth, her final erasure of the board. By destroying her own farm and dying in the blaze, she eliminated every thread that could lead back to her crimes. Every suitor, every letter, every shallow grave, except his. And now she was out there somewhere, watching, waiting, free. The fire hadn't ended the game, it had just made it infinite. When an individual predator vanishes, the most dangerous predator of all often steps in: the system. Chris thought that with Belle gone, he could finally breathe. But within hours of the fire, he saw the truth: her absence didn't weaken the threat, it multiplied it. Now, the game wasn't about one widow with a shovel and a smile. It was about the forces that had quietly allowed her to operate for years, and who now had every reason to make sure the full story never surfaced. The sheriff arrived at the smoldering ruins, flanked by 2 deputies who took meticulous notes. But they weren't collecting evidence. They were controlling it. Items were cataloged, boxed, and removed under the official pretense of investigation. But Chris knew they'd vanish into the same black hole where inconvenient truths go to die. The town's newspaper printed its first story before the ashes had cooled: local woman, Belle Gunness, victim of tragic blaze. The language was deliberate. Victim, not suspect. Not killer. The narrative was already being set in stone. Chris tried to speak. He told anyone who'd listen about the letter, about the missing men, about the poisoned livestock. But the people who believed him whispered their agreement in dark corners. And the ones in power simply looked through him. He saw it in their eyes stop. "You are not supposed to be saying this." That's when he understood. Belle's real power had never been her charm or her cunning. It was her alliances. The banker who quietly processed her inheritances. The politicians who dined at her table. The merchants who benefited from the steady flow of men with full pockets and empty futures. They had all fed at her table, and they would protect that feast by erasing the memory of it entirely. Chris was no longer just fighting Belle. He was fighting the architecture of silence itself. The machine that keeps certain crimes hidden, not because they can't be proven, but because too many people profit from forgetting. And here's the part most men never grasp. When you're up against a single enemy, you can kill them. But when you're up against the system that creates the enemy, killing her only makes it stronger. The letter in Chris's pocket was still the last surviving proof of her trail. But proof is useless when no one is allowed to believe it. And the men in that town were already being taught exactly what to believe. When they forbid you to speak the truth, your mission is no longer to shout louder. It's to plant it where they can't pull it out. Chris stopped going to the sheriff. He stopped arguing in the saloon. He stopped waving the letter like a torch in the dark. That was the game they wanted him to play. The loud madman who rants until nobody listens. And when nobody listens, you can make a man disappear in broad daylight. Instead, he started working in shadows. If the system's strength was in its control of public memory, then the only way to fight was to bypass memory altogether. He began choosing his listeners carefully, men with debts they couldn't pay, drifters with no roots, women who had lost brothers and fathers and never got answers. He didn't tell them everything, just enough to plant a splinter in their mind. A letter? He'd say quietly over a shared drink, from one of the missing men. Describing Belle's farm. I've read it. I've seen things. And then he'd change the subject. The trick was simple: leave them with a hole they need to fill. People will forget a speech. They won't forget a question. Within weeks, the questions started spreading faster than the official story could keep up. What happened to Belle? Why was her skull so small? Where did the gold go? These weren't accusations. They were seeds. And seeds grow best when no one sees the gardener. Chris hid the original letter somewhere no man in La Porte would ever think to look. Beneath a loose board in an abandoned church 3 towns over. He made copies by hand, never in full, scattering fragments in different places: a pawn shop in Chicago, a safe deposit box under a false name, the pocket of a passing rail worker who didn't even know he was carrying it. By now, Belle could have been anywhere, wearing another name, spinning the same trap in another lonely town. But Chris realized something important. As long as the seeds of her truth kept germinating, she could never fully disappear. He wasn't trying to topple the system anymore. He was infecting it. And that infection would either wither in the dark or, one day, choke the roots of the tree itself. Halfway down this road, a man stops being the person he was. If you've made it this far, write this in the comments. Twice see the soil remembers. Because it does. And because the act of writing it marks you as one of the few willing to see. Truth, once set loose, stops belonging to the man who released it. Chris had imagined his whispers spreading like roots, silent, steady, inevitable. But roots have a way of breaking stone, of finding cracks in places you never intended. And in the dead of winter, one of those cracks found him. A man appeared at his door. Tall, sharp-eyed, wearing a coat too fine for the frozen back roads. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and stepped inside like the cold itself. "I've been following your little story," the man said, his voice smooth but edged with something that made Chris's stomach tighten. "You've got quite a talent for leaving questions in your wake." Chris didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man already knew. The stranger leaned against the wall, gloved hands folded. "Belle Gunness," he continued, "a useful woman, served a purpose. That purpose ended. The people I work for prefer their tools retired." He smiled thinly. "And they prefer their loose ends cut." It hit Chris in a rush. This wasn't some random drifter or curious investigator. This was someone from inside. Someone sent not just to warn him, but to remind him how deep the roots of Belle's protection truly went. Whatever she was, the man said, she didn't act alone. She was a piece on the board. Now the board changes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've been planting seeds. You think you're spreading truth. But do you know what happens when truth reaches the wrong hands?" Chris stayed silent, but he understood. If one of his seeds reached another Belle, or someone worse, then he wasn't awakening minds. He was arming predators. The man turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "You have 2 choices, Chris. Pull up what you've planted or watch what grows when men like us water it." The door shut. The cold followed him out. Chris sat there for a long time, staring at the fire. That was the moment he realized the oldest trick in the game. You think you're the one unmasking the darkness, until you see the darkness studying you, deciding whether to keep you alive. And for the first time, Chris wondered, Was he still hunting Belle? Or had he become her heir? There comes a moment when a man realizes the thing he's fighting isn't out there anymore. It's in him. Chris didn't sleep that night. The fire in the stove burned low, but the conversation in his head burned hotter. The stranger's words had planted their own seed. One he didn't know if he could rip out. Pull it up, destroy it all, disappear. That was the safe path. The path that left him alive but useless. Or push forward, knowing the infection could spread into hands far colder, far hungrier than Belle's. The more he turned it over, the more he saw a truth no man wants to face. Every weapon you create can be taken from you. A blade doesn't care who wields it. At dawn, he saddled his horse and rode. Not to the hiding places where his copies were stashed, but to the men and women who carried pieces of the story in their minds. One by one, he found them. Not to erase what they knew, but to reshape it. He told them Bella's crimes, but he stripped away the names of towns, the locations, the details that could guide another predator straight to her method. He made the story jagged, incomplete, still poisonous to the system, but useless to anyone trying to recreate it. It was a dangerous balance. Too much truth, and the wrong hands could weaponize it. Too little, and the seeds would die before they could crack the soil. But as he worked, Chris realized something the stranger hadn't considered. Corruption doesn't just thrive on secrets. It thrives on precision. The more exact the map, the easier it is to follow. Remove a few landmarks, and the hunters walk in circles forever. By nightfall, Chris had shifted his role. He wasn't the chronicler anymore. He wasn't the archivist of Belle Gunness's evil. He had become the editor of it. And in that role, he understood the cost. You can never again claim moral purity. Once you decide which truths live and which die, you step into the same domain as the people you despise. He was no longer just resisting the darkness. He was shaping it. And men who shape darkness always end up paying for it. You can dull a blade, but you can't stop it from cutting. 2 months passed. Winter's ice began to loosen its grip, and with it came the news, slow at first, carried in half-whispered tavern talk, then louder, until it reached Chris like the echo of a shot he hadn't heard. Another widow, another farm, and 3 men missing. He rode to the town where it had happened, telling himself it couldn't be connected. That the gaps he'd carved into Belle's story had made it impossible to replicate. But when he saw the farmhouse, isolated on a strip of land too far from the main road, his stomach turned. She was younger, sharper, less greedy than Belle, and the graves she'd dug weren't for money. They were for silence. The men she lured were the wrong kind of witnesses, the kind who stumbled too close to truths meant to stay buried. Chris found one of them still alive. Barely. Frozen hands, a voice raw from screaming underground. Shush, she knew? The man rasped. Knew what happened in La Porte? Said someone. Told her enough to finish the rest. Chris's mind locked onto the word. Enough. Not everything, just enough. Which meant somewhere in his network, a seed had slipped through his fingers, sprouted in soil he couldn't see. And it hit him with brutal clarity. There is no such thing as safe truth. Once a fragment exists, it hunts for completion. Humans are wired to fill the blanks, and predators are wired to weaponize what they find. Standing over the new graves, Chris felt the same cold he'd felt when the stranger walked into his home. Only now, the cold came from inside. He'd told himself he was reshaping the darkness, taming it, even turning it against the system that bred Belle. But this was proof the darkness doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care who you aim it at. It only cares that it spreads. And now, it was spreading without him. As he turned to leave, the rescued man grabbed his sleeve. You have to stop it, he croaked. Chris didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure he could. Because he wasn't sure he wanted to. Because a part of him, the part that had crossed too many lines, understood something no innocent man would. Once the soil remembers, it doesn't forget for you. The most dangerous moment isn't when your enemy steals from you. It's when they make you believe you've won. Chris didn't have to wait long to see the pattern shift. Within weeks, whispers of Belle's legend began surfacing in newspapers, not as warnings, not as condemnation, but as stories. Cleaned, polished, stripped of the filth that made them true. The same institutions that once buried her name were now parading it. A dark romance for the masses.
A mystery.
For Sunday readers to sip coffee over. And threaded between the lines, Chris recognized his own edits. The gaps he had left were now being filled with their version of the truth. It wasn't the truth anymore. It was a narrative. They had taken his half-poisoned seed and grafted it into their own tree, pruning it so it no longer threatened them. Instead, it served them. Belle was no longer a symptom of their rot. She was a whole one, off, an aberration, a cautionary tale that made the system look innocent. He saw the fingerprints everywhere, in the language, in the way every dangerous detail was framed to support a single, unspoken idea. This could never happen again. The message was clear. The people in power weren't afraid of Belle's story getting out. They were afraid of the wrong version getting out. And now, thanks to Chris, they had both the weapon and the leash. One night, the stranger returned. Same coat, same eyes, but this time there was no warning in his voice, only satisfaction. You see, the man said. Control the story, control the fear. Control the fear, control the people. We don't hide every monster. Chris. Some monsters are useful in the right light. Chris wanted to spit at him, but he didn't. Because part of him knew this was exactly what he'd been trying to do. He'd just been outplayed. The stranger leaned in close. You can't kill a story once it takes root. But you can choose the gardener. And now you work for us? The door closed behind him, and Chris understood the real trap. He wasn't a rebel anymore. He was an asset. The system didn't silence him. They absorbed him. And there's no prison tighter than the one you help build yourself. Some cages don't need locks. They're built from the belief that escape is impossible. Chris spent weeks moving through the system's halls. Not their marble offices, but the shadow corridors where decisions were made without signatures. He met the handlers, the archivists, the editors who curated the stories the public was allowed to remember. Belle's name was now just one weapon in their armory. They had hundreds. Some were real, some half-true, some invented outright, each designed for a single purpose, to shape the emotional weather of the masses. Chris wasn't chained, but he was watched. Always. They wanted him close enough to feel important, but far enough from the core that he couldn't touch the real levers. Still, he learned. He saw patterns. He noticed which truths were buried, which were fed to the people, and which were twisted until they pointed in the opposite direction. And as he listened, the idea began to grow. Reckless, dangerous, intoxicating. What if he could turn their weapon back on them? Not with the edited fragments they gave him, but with something sharper. Something they didn't see coming. Late one night, he found his chance. A shipment of restricted files arrived in a locked crate. Stories too volatile for public release, too damning to twist into propaganda. They were supposed to be destroyed. Chris read every word. And in those pages, he saw the architecture of the machine laid bare. Not the myths, not the illusions, but the skeleton of power itself. The names, the events, the proof that the rot went deeper than even he had guessed. He could leak it. He could burn their illusion to the ground. But he knew the cost. The moment he acted, the system would crush him, not with a bullet, but with erasure. They'd rewrite him into a villain, a madman, a monster like Belle. And when the dust settled, they'd still be standing. It was the oldest question in the dark arts of power. Do you destroy the empire knowing you'll be buried with it? Or do you stay inside, shaping it from the shadows, even if it means becoming what you hate? Chris closed the file, his pulse hammering like war drums. He had until sunrise to decide. One path was death. The other was damnation, and he couldn't yet tell which was worse. In the end, there are no clean choices. Only the one you can live with, and the one that will haunt you forever. The sky was still black when Chris stepped outside. Cold air bit his face. But it wasn't the winter that made his hands shake. It was the weight of the decision pressing on his ribs like a stone slab. In his pocket, the stolen file felt heavier than lead. He could already hear the chaos it would unleash if it ever reached daylight. Riots, collapses, alliances shattered overnight. But he also heard the laughter of the stranger, saw the slow curl of his smile. The system didn't fear the truth. It feared the uncontrolled truth. Chris lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl upward and vanish. He realized something then. Destruction was simple. Fire was quick. But replacement, that was the true game. If he simply burned it all, others would step in, eager to rebuild the same machine under a different name. If he stayed, he could poison it from the inside. Not in one strike, but in 100 cuts. Slow. Subtle. The kind of sabotage no one could trace until it was too late. But the cost, it meant becoming part of it. It meant wearing the same mask as those he despised. It meant that to the outside world, he would Chris made his choice. By 6000, the file was back in the crate. By 6015, it was sealed and tagged for destruction. But not before he had copied certain pages. The ones that could shift a single narrative, erode a single cornerstone of their foundation. The stranger met him in the hallway. No words were exchanged, but the nod was enough. Chris had chosen to play. He walked away, the stolen pages hidden in a place they'd never look. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a rebel. Not anymore. He was something far more dangerous. And somewhere deep beneath the soil, the memory of Belle Gunness waited. Not as a woman, not even as a killer, but as the seed of an idea. One that Chris intended to plant again. One cut at a time. Because the most enduring graves are the ones you bury inside people's minds.